Doctors who have been in an "is anybody here a doctor" situation. What happened? Recently before the coronavirus I was taking an international flight. The flight attendant asked on if there was a doctor aboard. I was actually asleep, but somehow that woke me up. And I was like, wait, you need a doctor? Turns out a patient was experiencing some diffuse chest pain. Went to examine him, and minor alarm bells rang when I asked him some questions. I had a very high suspicion that this guy was having an aortic dissection. I told the flight attendant, who passed on the information to the pilot. The pilot made an emergency landing at a different airport, met with an ambulance. I later called the hospital to find out what exactly it was, and turns out I was right. If they had carried on, he might not have survived. Edit. Aortic dissection is when the aorta tears/is about to burst. Edit 2. Holy yes, this blew up. I'm at work right now, but I'll try to work through the comments when I can. Oh my goodness. Great job. You should feel 10/10ths proud of yourself every day for the rest of your life. Not a doctor, but I was on a flight from DC to Chicago and got so sick I passed out upon landing. As I was coming to, I was being aided by a man and heard another person shout, "Are you a doctor?" The man helping me replied, "I'm the Surgeon General of the United States." This was Vivek Murthy, and it happened around 2015. He was the kindest and humblest guy. "Are you a doctor?" "I'm the doctor." My mom has had to respond twice on flights when someone was in distress. The first time was in the air and a guy was having a diabetic low. She monitored him until we landed. The second time was sitting on the tarmac when a guy had a stroke. They delayed the flight and took the dude off the plane. She also said that after the first one, the airline sent her a thank you card and said, "Please use these enclosed vouchers to get tickets to a destination of your choosing." But they forgot to include the vouchers. She said she thought it would be rude to write back and say, "Hey, you forgot the vouchers." That's how they gesture. Also, good job on your mom in both cases. Sounds like someone took the free flights for themselves before sending the card out. Edit. Spelling. I'm currently a first-year resident, internal medicine in Sweden. This happened last year, about a year after I graduated, so I was still relatively fresh out of med school. I was flying home from my vacation from the Mediterranean, or 3-hour flight, when they announced on the speaker system that they were looking for a healthcare professional. Stood up when they called out a second time. Maybe 15 seconds later, it was me and a bit older nurse who went up to the front rows, where a middle-aged male was awake but unresponsive. As I didn't really have a lot of experience and was somewhat panicking, kept the panic internally to myself. It's scary being alone. I fell back to ATLS and eventually noticed that I had a D problem. Decreased strength in one of his arms and one-sided facial droop that was quite mild. Long story short, I suspected a stroke, but couldn't really do a whole lot. We were 30 minutes away from landing at the time of the initial call. They didn't deviate or anything. I didn't feel like I did that much, to be honest, except say that I suspected a stroke and asked if they could call an ambulance to the airport. The airplane seemed to land a bit faster than it usually does, and as we went off the runway, there was an ambulance waiting off the taxiway. When the ambulance staff boarded the plane, I gave a short report and that's basically it. I got a thank you from the relatives and the stewardesses. They asked me to write down my name and email, but I haven't heard anything since. Edit. Spelling. I was in the car with my mother, who is a doctor, when a bad wreck happened about a mile ahead of us on the road outside town. I didn't see the crash, but all of a sudden we were pulling up to the aftermath, next to a grey-blue Subaru that had its entire front pushed in. The woman driving was still in her seat, sitting upright. I couldn't see her feet, but she had bitten clean through her lower lip so that I could see her teeth and gums. Part of her lip was dangling. My mom got out of the car, maybe called 991, I can't remember, and rushed the driver. She put her hands through the windows and held the woman's head and neck completely still, while telling her repeatedly that help was on the way and she needed to stay calm and still. It was the most drastic case of code switching ever. My mom is a neurotic. Scatterbrained nerd, but as soon as she was out of the car she moved so fast and was so focused. I can't remember how long we waited there before help came, and they used the jaws of life to open the car. I do remember very vividly how the firefighter had to move my mom's hands away from the driver for her because she couldn't unlock her hands and arms. Your mum sounds like an utter professional and a total badass besides. Not a doctor, but my daddy's. One time last year he was at a game for our local baseball game, and one of the spectators went into cardiac arrest partway through the game. The whole game stopped. Things went silent as he ran over and assessed the situation before starting compressions. He and the baseball team's doctor kept switching until an ambulance arrived, and I think he ended up being okay. Wow, congrats to your dad. I was flying out of my home airport during my intern year. I had just finished my cardiology rotation, intensive care. The flight attendant asked for a doctor because a passenger had severe chest pain. It turned out there was also my senior resident and my CCU attending on the same flight, unknown to me. All three of us had worked together for the past 2 months and signed off the CCU the day before, like a well-oiled machine. We took care of the patient. He was stable thankfully. An ambulance was waiting for him when we landed, and I was very grateful to have both my senior resident and my attending at the time. Not a doctor, but the patient in this scenario. I was on a long flight, 4 hours, and developed excruciating pain and urge to urinate. Holed up in a washroom for 20 minutes when a flight attendant inquired if I was okay, explained the problem, and they got on the PA system inquiring about a doctor on the flight. The doctor, correctly, suggested I was suffering from previously undiagnosed kidney stones. They passed a 2-liter bottle of water into the washroom and suggested I drink as much as possible. While I didn't pass the stones, the water flushed my kidneys enough to make the balance of the flight bearable. I sought medical attention upon arrival at my destination. My friend has had it happen twice to him, both heart-related in restaurants. Was able to use a defibrillator to save one's life and the other unfortunately passed. Defibrillators don't work if the heart is completely stopped, and CPR is a long shot and didn't work in this case. Many people do not realize that defibs correct the heart rhythm and will not work on anyone whose heart has stopped. I always thought it would shock the heart to start again if it has stopped beating. I have a doctorate, but I'm not a medical doctor. But shortly after receiving my doctorate I was on a transatlantic flight and the flight attendant came around asking if any one of us was a doctor. I very briefly considered answering jokingly yes, but not that kind of doctor. But the man in front of me said that he was. And as he was leaving with the attendant he said to his wife, "I've been waiting my whole career for this." About 15 minutes later he came back, slightly disgruntled. Turned out a woman in first class was having a panic attack, and she ended up with 3 doctors around her all frustrated that they didn't get to do an emergency tracheotomy at 35,000 feet. A woman was shopping at the grocery store I worked at, with her car parked out front, with her husband in the car, listening to the radio. She went out, couldn't wake him, and came inside asking for a doctor. There wasn't one. But I knew CPR. I performed it until the EMT showed up, and he was pronounced dead at the hospital. Never saw the woman again, which is unfortunate, because she was definitely a regular, and very pleasant. It probably took a good 5 years before I was able to convince myself that him dying wasn't on me. It was a lot of, what if I wasn't doing it right? Did I miss a step? Was I rushing? Before I allowed myself to believe that I truly performed my best. That I was likely doing it right, as I did have quite a lot of repeated trainings. My dad was a fireman/EMT, and I was a Red Cross certified babysitter, and had to have yearly CPR refresher certifications, and that he just wasn't meant to make it. Happened in an airplane. Me, as a 4th grade medical student, and my professor at an airplane for going to a medical congress in our country. A man 50-ish years old lost his consciousness. We got there before the cabin crew yelled the situation. Had to do CPR for 25 minutes until we had landed at an airport for emergency landing. We still had a 1 5-hour away, and we also landed off with him to make him reach hospital safely. It was a rural military airport. Airplane waited us to return. Took a 40 minutes later after we landed. Got to our destination. In return flight, we were upgraded to business class and taken from our hotel by a private chauffeur. My father, doctor, 30 years ago was sent to work in southern Italy, although he already lived with my mother in the north, and a large part of the salary ended up in tickets to return by plane every weekend. The fact is that during the flight to the south, lasting about 1 hour, they do not give anything to eat, except they pass with a trolley to give candies. Needless to say, the classic situation of the old woman who chokes on it and cannot breathe. My dad was called, and with a few heavy blows on the back he managed to get the candy out of the poor old woman. A week goes by and the day of the return on the plane comes. The trolley with the candies passes promptly, and out of nowhere a girl sitting in front of my father who was trying to get one is blocked by her friend. Don't take it. Last week they told me that an old woman got choked up, and to free her a doctor had to slap her really hard on the back. I like the thought of an Italian flight where everyone panics, but they find a doctor, and he assesses the situation very carefully, and he chooses not to use a Heimlich maneuver, but instead of that, professionally elects to slap her on the back, but like really hard. I'm a nurse. We are taught to do 5 hard back slaps before moving on to abdominal thrusts. Edit. I'm in the UK. It may well be different elsewhere, but that's certainly what we are taught here. Not a doctor, but story is still relevant in an opposite sort of way. Was watching a children's soccer game. 2 11-year-old girls collided. One got up, and her arm was hanging 90 degrees down halfway between her wrist and her elbow. It's not supposed to do that. She continued to play for a second, and then realized what her arm was doing. She totally bugged out. She started screaming. I think something is wrong here. All of the parents are yelling at the girl to take a knee and the ref to stop the game. I jumped the fence with another parent. We get her to sit on her knee and rest her broken arm against the bent knee. I yell out, "Where's her parents?" Nothing. Is anyone here a doctor? Nothing. At this point it's been like 2 minutes since the original and obvious break. I take my phone out to call 911. 911 apostrophe HI. What's your emergency? Me, I'm sure you've gotten multiple calls by now, but I just want to make sure. We've got a girl with broken arm here. Has anyone called for an ambulance? 911. No. No one has called. Where are you located? There had to be 500 people watching this game. It was a regional tournament. No doctor. No parent. No one had called 911. About 10 minutes later the ambulance arrived. Mother arrived at the same time. She had to park a mile away. Big tournament, and just finally made it back to the game. Girl gets carted away. The remaining girls somewhat finish the game that had been shortened by 30 minutes due to this incident. Finally the next game starts and I take my seat on the sidelines next to some random parent. Her husband comes up next to us a few minutes later, and she turns to him and says, "You missed all of the action." This man, pointing to me, had to help a girl who broke her arm. "Really?" he says. "That's too bad. I probably could have helped." I turn to him and ask him why that is. "Are you a doctor?" "Yes," he says. "I'm a pediatric orthopedic surgeon." For F's sake. The first doctor to show up when it's too late is the most qualified doctor. I just stared at him for a few seconds, mouth agape. He looked at me sheepishly and just said, "I know, right? Don't feel bad. You probably did the same thing I would have done. But I would have known it was the right thing to do." Lesson of the day. The more people around, the more likely that everyone assumes someone else had called 911. TLDR. Child broke her arm in front of me. A child arm fixer doctor happened to arrive just after she was carted off in ambulance. Bystander effect. The greater the number of bystanders, the less likely it is that one of them will help. Something about pointing at people if necessary might force them to actually do something. My wife and I were waiting for a plane to take off, and they asked for a doc over the intercom. My wife got up and there was a guy lying in the aisle, already dead. She couldn't do anything, had to sign some forms. They got the guy off the plane. and made an announcement that the guy was in stable condition. Which is technically true for some definition of the word stable. I had a guy die next to me on a plane. They put the oxygen mask on him and pretended he was stable. He was a really large guy and they discussed what to do when we landed. Decided it would be too hard to get him down the aisle with everyone on board. So they emptied the plane first. I was a medical student flying back to start my second year. The flight attendant asks over the PA if there's a doctor on board. Me having finished my first year of medical school stay quiet. A few minutes later, the call goes out again to ask if there's a doctor on board. I decide to go and tell the flight attendant that I'm only a medical student going into my second year and I won't be offended if they say they don't need my services. The flight attendant instead is happy and takes me over to business class, where a woman was just coming to after passing out. In my head I'm thinking, oh shit, I haven't seen any patients, and now they're expecting me to perform. As I'm very nervously checking her vitals, a licensed physician comes over and tells me to keep continuing with the vitals. He gets me to administer oxygen to the patient and to assess her responsiveness, bowels, pulse, etc. It turns out that she had passed out and was a little anemic after further questioning about her medical history. After we took her back to her seat, the physician explained what the issue was. Then he said he'll do the paperwork that the airline required, and I was no longer needed. The plane landed at its destination and I ran off to catch my connecting flight. That's awesome that he guided you through it rather than taking over. Sounds like he makes a good teacher. When I was in high school, one of my neighbors asked for my mom, a doctor, because her husband had collapsed. My mom, who doesn't practice anymore, she teaches in medical school, immediately went to the house and assessed the unconscious man. She also asked me to come with her in case she needed something. As soon as we got there, I saw that people in the house were panicking, just standing still. Look at the man, but not my mom. She immediately checked if he had a pulse and if he was breathing. The way she acted was so calm and so sure of what to do. I felt that the man was in good hands and in a way made me relax. I felt that everything would be okay since she was here now. An ambulance couldn't arrive immediately, so she organized some of the neighbors to help transport the man to the nearest hospital. After that whole thing was done, my mom acted like it was nothing and just continued with what she was doing before it happened. I think that was the moment I realized how amazing doctors can be and how proud I'm to have a mom like that. Eventually I went to med school myself in hopes to be just like her. My family and I were at Disney World sitting outside the Garden Grill waiting for our table when all of a sudden a server comes out of the restaurant and briskly walks by with a frantic look on her face to grab a defibrillator off the wall right in front of us. I pipe up and ask, is that for real? Does someone need that? And she responds, unfortunately, yes. She was obviously super stressed because of what's happening and also the fact that Disney World is supposed to be a happy place. So she's trying her hardest not to draw attention to some sort of crisis despite dozens of people watching this unfold. I immediately offer, well, we've got 2 doctors here if you want. My dad and brother, without giving it much thought, because she's in a hurry and focused on what's going on, she reluctantly goes up, sure I guess. Follow me. So they go in there to check it out. I stay outside with the rest of the family as we look at each other like WTF is happening. After what seems like forever, my dad and brother come back and they're like everything's fine. It turns out an elderly gentleman passed out while eating and fell out of his booth and into the walkway. When my dad and brother got there, he had woken up, so they checked some stuff, pulse, vision, memory, etc. to see if it was something serious, but didn't find anything. I'm not sure what exactly caused it, but they said that he said he would be fine. So they left it at that. The meal ended up being pretty awesome cause a bunch of characters came by and thanked us as best they could without using voices. Obviously, we got a bunch of free food, and as we were leaving the server lady came up to me to thank us again and gave us some free picture frames and signed pictures of the Disney characters that were there. Not in the medical profession, but from my time in the military I knew basic life-saving techniques like CPR and what to do when someone is drowning. My story involved my son when he was 6 years old. We were in town for my father's funeral. That night at the hotel the kids were in the pool. It was packed. He was swimming in the shallow end. Next thing I know a girl is holding him saying I think he's drowning. I pulled him from the pool. Asked if he could breathe. He shook his head no. I laid him down. Rolled him to his side and hit his back. He started throwing up lungfuls of water. Finally he says he can breathe. My wife is freaking out and he is white as a ghost. He threw up probably 4 to 5 times. Worst part is, when I pulled him from the pool my first thought is I'm gonna watch home die. My wife said I reacted so fast that I had H out of the pool before she realized what was happening. I almost lost my composure when he looked at me and said thanks for saving me dad. I recommend if you can to take some basic life savings classes. Super lucky that the girl noticed. Used to be a lifeguard and it's super difficult to spot people drowning when the pool is busy and loud. Drowning people don't make much of a racket. They just slip away. I warn parents to keep an eye on their own kids in the pool, even if you think they can swim and there is a lifeguard on duty. Happy fun can turn to sorrow pretty damn quickly, and kids often overestimate their ability. I'm not a doctor, but I'm a nurse. Just yesterday morning, I heard these women screaming in the hallway of my hotel. We need help. Does anyone know CPR? I ran out the door and told these women I was a nurse. They took me to the front lobby where they found a young woman who seemed to have overdosed. She wasn't breathing, but she had a pulse at first. It started to get weaker then stopped altogether. I had to do 4 rounds of CPR before I felt a pulse again, and it was right as the ends were walking in. I work in nursing homes, and most people are DNRs. I've never had to do CPR on anybody. It's crazy that was my first time, and it was at a fucking hotel, and not even work. Then you just so happened to ask this question? Lol. You're amazing. She was so lucky you were there. Yes. Thank you you/tits out shits out.